Certainly good to see everyone tonight. Grab your Bible. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter, I'm going to do questions real quick for chapter 2, and then we'll get into chapter 3 tonight. Last week, if you were with us in person or at home, I told you that you were going to witness a miracle last week, and it happened. I covered an entire chapter in one class. Guess what? You're probably going to witness the exact same miracle tonight. I think we could probably cover all of chapter 3 this evening as well. They're shorter chapters. They're still kind of introductory kinds of things. Paul really isn't yet into the heart of what he wants to talk about. And he's going to have a kind of an interesting conversation with them here in chapter 3 that we'll see here in just a few moments. But before we get into that, I always like to go back, if I remember, and go back and look at the questions from the prior chapter. We'll run those real fast here just to refresh our memories, and then we'll jump into chapter 3 in our discussion this evening. And so the first question simply was, Paul did not want to bring sorrow to them, but what? Joy, right? He wanted to bring joy. His intent in all those challenges was not to upset them, but to just correct them. But his hope is that the joy of serving God in the right ways will be restored to them in the right ways. Paul did not write concerning his afflictions to grieve them, but for what purpose? Or that they might understand what? Right. And the benefit of really, in some sense, is just understanding his love for them. And not trying to upset you or cause, but just wants you to know the love that he has for them, and that's why he's trying to help lead them. What should they do with the one who seeks their comfort in his afflictions? Forgive, right? They're supposed to forgive that one. And what reason did Paul say he wrote this letter in verse 9? Right. And to guide in that sense, educate in that sense. Did Paul understand how the devil worked? Yes, he understood how the devil would operate and function, and his concern was that Satan could use some of the challenges that were going on there to disrupt them. What disappointment does Paul mention in verse 13? Yeah, so he was hoping to connect with Titus, and basically, why? Right, he would have learned from Titus how they responded to the first letter that went to him. Paul can't have a response until he hears back. And so he's anxious to hear, and he kind of also talks about the fact that he didn't want to go to Corinth until he heard, right? He wants to hear back from them before he makes his trip there, and so it was important. He's been disappointed that he hadn't caught up with him yet. What does God cause for us when faced with such afflictions? Yeah, help and strength and way and answers to those things. What result does the preaching of the gospel have on those who accept it and those who reject it? Verse 16. Right, so embrace it to life or reject it to spiritual death that comes from it. And so the very same message, depending on how you react to it, can have two varying responses or reactions or results. What did they do in the sight of God? And that was an odd question, wasn't it? Let me run you back to the very end of the chapter, and I'll show you. So, say it again. Yeah, so perpetuating the message but as of sincerity, but as of God, in the sight of God, speak we in Christ, he says there at the end of the chapter. In the sight of God, Paul says, we are presenting and speaking the genuine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In many ways, that's a setup statement for the things he's going to continue to say here in chapter 3. But he's evidencing the fact that there's a sincerity and a legitimacy to the things that he's sharing with them within his preaching of the gospel. Okay, so let's jump back now into the book itself and begin here in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. And it's kind of an interesting statement that Paul makes here at the beginning. He basically asks, do we begin again to commend ourselves, or need we, as some others, epistles of commendation to you, or letters of commendation from you? Basically, Paul's saying, would there be some reason for us to need somebody to revalidate us to you, or for you to write us a letter so that if we traveled to some other church that we could say, well, here, the Corinthian church believes in us, and so you guys should believe in us. So that's not really his point, by the way. He's using that to set up what he's about to say. But he's like, do I really need a letter from you? Do you need a letter from me? Do I need to bring a letter from some other church in order that you can confirm who I am? Aren't we past that? It's kind of what Paul says. Have we not had enough communication and a bond and relationship between us that we don't need to be commending each other to one another in that sense? Because verse 2 says what? You are our epistle written in our hearts. You're the evidence. You want to know about the fruit of what the work of the Apostle Paul is? You are. If somebody wants to know the commendation of the Apostle Paul, then just look at Corinth or any other of the churches that he helped establish and bring to benefit in the gospel. There's all the evidence you need. There's no need for any exchange of communication or any letters being brought one to the other in order to evidence who Paul is to them. You're our epistle in our hearts, known and read of all men. They witness and see the kind of faith and conduct and behaviors of the church there in Corinth, and that should evidence to anyone else that commend who Paul is and what he accomplished and what he had done. Forward, I want to keep going because there's a larger thought process here. In fact, verse 2 and verse 3 are part of one longer sentence. For as much as ye are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart. Now Paul's getting to really where the conversation is heading. I don't need an ink. Do I need an ink? Do I need somebody to put ink to paper and for you guys to send over here? Do I need ink to paper so that somebody will know who the Apostle Paul is? Or is there some other way to evidence that? Then Paul answers, verse 2. Oh yeah, there is an easier way to evidence that. I don't need ink to paper. What I need is people just to simply look at the church at Corinth, and that's epistle enough, that's letter enough to know the work and accomplishment and purposes that the Apostle Paul has. All of that, by the way, is the setup conversation because he's about to do a contrast of what two things? That's right. He's about to give a contrast of the Old Testament law and the New Testament covenant in Jesus Christ. So these verses are, if you will, the setup conversation to lead and prep them to be ready to have a conversation about we don't need the tablets of stone anymore. We need the New Testament in the Spirit of Christ that is written where? In the hearts of men. So that's where he's heading. That's the conversation. That's the understanding that he's leading them to in this early part of this chapter. He's about to have a conversation about the importance of understanding the difference between the Old Testament covenant and the New Testament covenant in Jesus Christ, and how important it is to stay established in that New Testament covenant. And if you wanted an oversimplification of what chapter 3 is about, there it is. The oversimplification of chapter 3 is in that statement. The New Testament's better than the Old. The New Testament is the one that saves souls and the Old could not. The New Testament is the one they needed to be staying established in because the Old Testament can't accomplish what the New Testament can. That in a nutshell is what chapter 3 is about. And then he'll give some more detail about that as we work through this. And so the epistle that's important as it relates to the way they ministered to the church there at Corinth is not about somebody writing it down and validating it, but it's about the evidence of what's going on in the lives that have been changed, in the hearts that have been changed, Not because there's some table of stone to evidence that, and that's the setup conversation. Thoughts or comments up to verse 3? Okay. So verse 4 then. And such trust have we through Christ to Godward, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God, who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. And so let's talk a little bit about this. And that was, again, another one of those kind of long sentences. Verse 4 through verse 6 is all one sentence, at least in English. I couldn't tell you whether it was that way in Greek or not. But so here's this. Did they even? Never mind. Now I'm teaching myself in the middle of trying to teach you all. But so Paul wants them to think about this idea that number one, even if somebody validated or sent a letter along with Paul and said, Paul's a great guy, is that really enough? And Paul says, no, the sufficiency isn't about Paul. The sufficiency is about whom? It's about God and Christ. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves. Paul said, we're not anything. That sound familiar, by the way? Isn't that exactly what he said in the first letter? Remember when he talked about the disputes and the division and the divisiveness that was going on among them? And he said, some of you are saying, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I am of Cephas. And his response was, which one of those guys was crucified on a cross for you? None of us died on a cross for you. The only one that really matters is Jesus. He said that in the very first letter, and he's saying the same basic thing here. The sufficiency isn't about Paul. In other words, the power of the message isn't because Paul said it. The power of the message is because it was delivered through the Spirit from God. That's the real benefit and power of the message. And too often, you can get caught up in the personalities and forget the real source. And so Paul's like, don't do that. Don't get caught up as if the authority as an apostle is really what makes things right or wrong. It's really about whether or not God has delivered the message. He's the one that made us what in verse 6? Able ministers. When they spoke about Paul's writings and his physical presence, what did people say? Right, they don't match. He writes as if he's Goliath, right? He writes as if he's larger than life in terms of the manner in which he communicates. You see him in person, people said, wait a minute, that can't be the same guy. I always think about it in the sense of if you watch any television that has a lot of comment, if you watch sports or something that has a lot of commentary, and you hear this voice, 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 and then for the first time they show a quick glimpse of them on television, and you're almost shocked. Wait a minute, that the voice and the person don't match. You know, you've been hearing this big booming voice maybe, and it's this wee little guy. Not picking on wee little guys. There was one that climbed a tree once and saw Jesus, and it worked out fine for him. But you understand what I'm saying? Well, that's kind of the way Paul was. Read his writings, seemed like a different guy than when you saw him in person. And Paul says, it's not about us. And if it was about my physical abilities, then I wouldn't be anywhere. But God's made us able to be the ministers He desires. Go ahead, Bob. and I'll get to what Bob was asking here in a minute, so you understand. There are little apples and oranges, and meaning it's not what's happening here in 2 Corinthians 3 isn't exactly the same as that. But let me rephrase what Paul or Bob's question was. Bob's talking about the traditional, I don't know how else to define it, but our traditional approach when a member from one church might move to another church or something, our traditional approach has been we would send a letter. And that letter would commend or share a brief summary of the person that's going from congregation A to congregation B, and vice versa. The tradition has been that we would embrace, somebody would come, they would bring to us. If they were coming to us, they'd bring a letter with them. If they were going, we would send a letter with them. And I keep calling you Paul tonight. You're Apostle Paul tonight, Bob. I'm sorry. But you're probably bigger, actually, than he was. But anyway. But he is that looking and thinking a little bit about what Paul's kind of generic, if we can use it as a generic principle here, should what we know about the heart of a person, could that be sufficient, if I'm framing your question right, could that be sufficient in lieu of or in place of a letter? And my quick answer to that is yes. If I always try to be careful, because I know that sometimes when we've done certain things a certain way for a long period of time, anytime you say something a little different than that, you may sound like you're saying, well, they shouldn't have done it that way. And that's not the case. I think that it was a fine way to go about doing that communication. The question really isn't, was that an okay way to do it? The question was, is it necessary? And then there are some cases where the answer to that is no. If I know somebody just as well as the church they were at, then we're just talking about formalities. And if you know anything about me at all in spending my growing up years here, but more particularly in the last 10 years that I've been with you, I am not big on formalities. I think that we have elevated formalities and tradition sometimes as if we had a Bible verse to base it on as the only thing that's acceptable in certain circumstances. And we've got to be careful not to do that. So I think it's wise, if I don't know anything, to reach out or to accept some kind of commendation from the place they're coming from in order to especially if I don't know anything. But just like Paul was saying in this circumstance, why would I go through a formality when the evidence of who this person is already there? And if that evidence is already there, then we're just talking about a formality rather than actually sending information that we didn't necessarily have before. Yeah, and we're really apples and oranges now. We're really kind of treading down a different road than 2 Corinthians 3. But I'll answer your question. So Bob's question then is if I'm drawing a scenario right, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but if we don't know anything and they refuse to bring us anything, would a local congregation have a right to say, I don't know whether we can accept you among us until we can learn something? Is that the right? Did I frame that right? And with some caution, I would say it would probably be wise to do so, and here's why. and I haven't seen this so much in recent years as maybe I saw it when I was younger. And I'll again try to be careful here, but what can happen sometimes is a guy can leave one place, and he was causing some real issues at that place. And when he left to go to another place, the place he left went, whew, not our problem anymore, and didn't say anything. And then he goes off to the next place and causes the same problems. Because that church didn't request or ask or investigate at all, and the prior church didn't make any attempt to note some. So I think there is some wisdom in, if I don't know anything at all, to do some, but within reason, if that makes sense. Just to do enough due diligence to know I'm not about to bring into fellowship somebody who has some kind of sin between them and God that needs addressed, or some challenge among some church that needs addressed, and so I think some caution would need to take place. But anytime you're applying human wisdom, and I always, when we go down these roads, this is where my mind always goes, is that anytime you're having to apply human wisdom to those kinds of equations, some people would rather deny. Their first reaction would be to deny. My first reaction would prefer to be accepting. If I'm going to err, if I have to err one way or the other. And then if there's problems, I'll address them if they come up. Yeah, if I'm, and again, I think that I'm with you a little bit on that. If I'm going to err in terms, if I feel like, well, I don't have the confidence maybe that I'd prefer to have, I would rather err on the side of embracing somebody who could be God's child, and in some senses let God address that. And again, if there's problems arise, then you address them, and you deal with them. And there is some evidence, by the way, just go back to the heart of your initial conversation. I mean, within the letters that Paul wrote and sent to places like Corinth, what else did he do? He would say, I'm sending so-and-so to see you guys. When he gets there, make sure you embrace and receive him. What's he doing? He just sent a letter. It's one of the examples that we might point to as to why we do it. Not just formal, but why do we do this? Well, because there is some biblical examples of how people were being commended to another group of people via a letter. But also keep in mind that was the means of communication they had. It could also now be done via phone call, email, instant message, Facebook message. You know what I mean? The same information could be conveyed in a multitude of ways today that they didn't have access to. Ink to paper was their, or ink to parchment, was their only means of communication. We have all kinds of ways that we could ascertain the very same information that would be written down in a letter. And that's the part where I say be careful about formalities, because everything that letter might tell you, you may already know, because you talked to an elder in another congregation, or you communicated from some other through a text message or an email or something. You know what I mean? There's all kinds of ways that same information can be ascertained. And if we say, well, no, if I don't have a sheet of paper in my hand that I can stick in a file drawer somewhere, then I'm not accepting it. That's a mistake. There's lots of ways that commendation could occur. in modern times. They didn't have all those things. That's interesting conversation. I can see why it sparks it a little bit with what Paul said here, but a little different than what he's addressing. Yeah, and I do. I think he's basically saying that his work as an evangelist is because of the strength and encouragement that God brought to him. He's able to do it because of what God's done. He's noted then, they're ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter. By the way, what's the letter? That's the Old Testament law. How do we know that? Well, we know that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the contrast being held here, right? New Testament, and in the very next phrase, so the New Testament, not the letter. We also know it because he says, but if the ministration of death, verse 7, written and engraved in stones, was glorious, so that whom? So that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance. So that frames it for us. He's contrasting the New Testament with the Old Testament law. We know that by the way he says it in terms of not the letter, because that's what their law was, right? The Old Testament law was letter of the law. Here's what you do it. That's the way it worked. And those things were written down on tables of stone in order that Moses might present them to the people. And they benefited from having that letter of the law that guided them. And what's interesting is, does Paul speak ill of that law? No, he calls it what? What's the word he uses? Glorious. He uses the word glorious. That Old Testament law to those Israel, it was glorious. Why was it glorious? Because it came from God. It's glorious because it came from God. The source is what makes it glorious. And the law governed them in the right ways because it came from Jehovah. The glory of it was wonderful. But they could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be what? Gone away. It's a pretty direct statement, isn't it? The law was glorious, but that glory was not intended to last what? Forever. God never intended for that law to stick around forever. Though glorious, though exactly what the Israelites needed, though it served its purpose exactly what they intended, it was not meant to be permanent. It was going to be done away. How shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? So, here's the point he's making. If that Old Testament law that was glorious, even though it was intended all along to be eventually done away with, then how much more glorious should the New Testament law be that is what? That is permanent. If there was glory in that which was temporary that God provided, can you imagine where the glory should be with something that is permanent that God provided? That's the contrast that Paul's making. One was intended to be temporary, and yet it had its own set of beauty. Another was meant to be permanent, and it has an even greater beauty to it, more glorious than the first. For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more doth the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. What was the basic challenge of the Old Testament law? It couldn't what? Okay, it couldn't save in the sense that it couldn't bring genuine remission of sin. That's ultimately going to necessitate the blood of Jesus. Though the blood of bulls and goats was for that purpose, those sacrifices served the purposes that God intended for them to have. But at the end of the day, without Jesus, all the Old Testament law could do for them is say, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. Make sure you do this, 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 and this. That's why he calls it what? The letter of the law. That's all it could do for them. was abide strictly to the letter of the law that God has given. Though glorious, though necessary, though beneficial to the Israelites to follow, it was, at the end of the day, a ministration of, he says, Paul defines it as condemnation. It's a ministration of condemnation, because at the end of the day, all it did was say, you missed that one. You missed that one. Why didn't you do that one? And so it was a ministration of condemnation. Therefore, the high priest did what? Every year. Every year he's back in there. Every year he's back in there for the sins of the people. Because all the law kept doing was just pointing out the sins of the people all along. Go ahead, Ray. Yeah? Yeah. And the high priest's yearly trek into the Holy was evidence of that. That there's this constant reminder that we don't have a permanent answer to sin. That's why the contrast, particularly in the book of Hebrews, where Jesus becomes our high priest that goes and makes that sacrifice once and for all. That's the difference. And so Paul says, why is the New Testament more glorious? Because it was permanent. Because it doesn't just condemn, it actually leads people to what? It's a ministration of righteousness. The only way to be righteous according to the Old Testament law was to do what? Yeah. You had to be perfect. The only way to be righteous under the Old Testament law was to be perfect in doing all that the Old Testament law said. How are we righteous under the New Testament? It's right. It's imputed to us. It's righteousness isn't about how good you are. Because if righteousness was only about how good you are, we're all what? In a heap of trouble, right? We're all, because we could never, I don't care how righteous or pious or how much conviction we believe we have, we would never reach the level of perfection necessary to be deemed as righteous on our own. But through Jesus, it can be imputed unto us. He can deem us righteous because of our faith, because of our convictions, not because of our perfect law-keeping, but because of our convictions and faith in Him. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect, by reason of the glory that excelleth. For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remaineth is glorious. So once again, in the contrast, which one should they be focused on? On the new. And maybe, again, that's part of this simplistic message that Paul's delivering to them. And my guess is maybe some of the folks there in Corinth are still struggling with this. They're still staying attached to that Old Testament system. They're still staying connected to that Old Testament covenant. And because of that, they're avoiding the more glorious relationship they can have in Jesus. And again, Paul says it was a great document, if you will, but that which remains is where the real focus should be. Seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. Why do you talk so plain and so direct and so purposefully, Paul? Well, it's because of the confidence we have in this New Testament that is more glorious than anything we've ever experienced before. We speak with great plainness because we've got a covenant, a new will and testament that came from Jesus that is so far superior and glorious to anything else that we've had before that it's worthy of us speaking in this way. Moses had what? Yeah, Moses, not as we speak with plainness of speech because it's all uncovered. Moses, when he spoke, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. It's an interesting concept when you think about it, if I understand it right. So Moses had to keep somewhat of a veil across the full intent and purpose of that Old Testament law. And again, if I'm getting the right sense here from Paul, the reason for that, think about it. If Moses comes down, begins to distribute the Old Testament law to the people, and at the end of giving that tremendous law to them says, and by the way, it's going away. It's not meant to be permanent. There's going to come a time where this law no longer needs to be followed and honored in the same way. What's the temptation? Yeah, just right. Just forget about it. Why should I even start? And then I'm going to wonder every day, is this the day it's over? Is this the day it's over? Right? You can think about all kinds of reasonings or ways that people might react in the wrong way to that Old Testament law if everything was given to them in clarity. Even to the extent that they would have to go back and look at the prophets to even know who Jesus was. You think about that. The law could have just spelled it out, right? God could have said, on a specific day, in a specific year, a specific moment in time, give them every detail of everything about Him, and there could have erased. But what He did instead was He spoke through the prophets and gave them enough. Wasn't every detail, but gave them enough detail where they should have been able to easily draw the right conclusions about Jesus when He arrived. My point simply is, God didn't always spell everything out. Moses had a veil. But we speak with great openness, Paul says. New Testament's completely unveiled through Jesus. Their minds were blinded, verse 14. For until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. That's an interesting thought when you think about it. That Paul says, and every time they stand up in the synagogue and read from that Old Testament law, and I would suppose that in some ways he means from the sense of still viewing it as that authoritative document that needs to be honored and respected and served. He says to them, the veil's still there. Until they come to a recognition that law has no longer the authority and power that it once did. It no longer has the same glory that it once did. Why? Because there's something more glorious than it ever could be. And they're still struggling with the connection to the Old Testament law. I apologize, no miracle tonight. Didn't quite get through the chapter. Almost. But I'll come back, Lord willing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this idea, because I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the Old Testament law, and this statement that Paul makes is pretty bold. You know, when we think about it. He basically says, now when they stand up and read the Old Testament, they're still living in the veiled times. The more emphasis and focus they put on that Old Testament law, they're still living in veiled times. And that creates challenges for them and would create challenges for us. And I want to talk a little bit about then what the role of the Old Testament was, and is to us today, and where our focus of attention should be today. So for those at home, thank you for joining us. And Lord willing, we'll be back Sunday at 10 o'clock, and we appreciate you stopping in and joining us tonight.
Holy Word.